It's Milan Fashion Week. First panel of Milan, and what a great one to talk about because kind of so much change in the air at the House of Gucci. But I think what's nice about Gucci now is we've kind of had a chance to see the new direction for the house, and it is very, very different. You know, everything from show space to offices to obviously to aesthetics. So really, really exciting. I think also what's happening at Gucci kind of throws up a lot of different themes that are really relevant to other runways and other people who are working within fashion, things like gender and androgyny, also branding and rebranding. I've got a fab set of panellists with me, super intelligent panel, not that those panels aren't incredibly intelligent, to help me unpick what's going on over in Milan. So before we start our discussions, I'll let you guys just introduce yourselves.
I'm Rosie Wallin, I'm a lecturer and researcher at St Martin's.
I'm Lucy Moore and I'm director of Claire de Rouen Books.
I'm Rebecca Gonsalves and I'm deputy fashion editor of The Independent.
I'm Hywel Davies, course leader of fashion communication at Central St Martin's.
I like the little wave you did when you introduced yourself. I think everyone should do that. Hello. So I want to start, and just before we delve into our topics, I want to start, what does everyone think of what's happening at Gucci? Because I think there's a firm aesthetic there.
It's just a phenomenon. It's just insane to think that we're talking about Gucci in a way that hasn't been in so long.
Yeah.
It's the sort of brand that it completely was so uninteresting, and it was just so kind of for one market, but not one that I think that most of us would really relate to. And obviously because it was such a huge advertiser, it still had people talking about it, but only kind of because they had to. Whereas now, everyone is talking about it, and it is infiltrating the way we see other things and the way people are presenting their work again. It's kind of insane to be talking about it in that way.
Have you noticed that at college? Because I guess it was one of those things where I can't imagine students being remotely interested in Gucci. Like, can you imagine? Who's your favourite designer?
Yeah, like
Frida Giannini. Like, it's so weird.
Students will always, as Rosie knows, students will always pick up on what's going on and what's new. And, I think, Gucci has such a bad rep for being so commercial and so uncool and
Italian,
corporate and everything just about the brand, and it just seemed so out of place with what was really going on in contemporary fashion. So it was just, I think it's because it was quite a quick shift that it became such a talked about thing because it happened so quickly.
A fashion drama.
Yeah.
And what do we all think of what Alessandro Michele is doing there? He said some really interesting, some quite bold quotes, like he's talked about, I'm trying to cause a little revolution inside the company. He's made some points about his aesthetic which have kind of clarified, I think, what he's doing. Vogue did a good interview with him, and he talked about a different language, a new way to talk about beauty and sexiness, and he says sexiness is an old word, it's about sensuality now. He also talked about being really engaged with the pop symbols of the company, so that's the kind of the branding. And he also referred to what he does as fake vintage, which I thought was quite interesting. It made me think a lot of Saint Laurent, which goes back to what you were saying.
Oh, this is the last collection.
So what do we think of that kind of fake vintage thing? It's quite interesting.
It's so honest to say that.
Yeah,
it's refreshing.
Yeah,
it's very refreshing.
Because all the designers do that, but they just don't usually say they're doing it, do they?
Yeah.
That's quite revolutionary in itself, to be very transparent about what you're doing in terms of your relationship to the past as a designer.
Well, he said that in old things he finds modernity, which I think is the case for lots of people now. Like, everyone's obsessed with, all the time they're talking about why young people are so nostalgic, but it's true, like, old feels very new.
And how it's curated, how it's put together is the kind of thing that's cool, isn't it? It's not so much the piece itself, but what's worn with it and how it's put together and who's wearing it. A dress on a boy is a different thing to a dress on a girl. So that kind of thing.
But I don't really think it is revolutionary in terms of fashion, in terms of what he's doing. I think it's more about, because it's such a departure from where Gucci was.
I think for the brand it's revolutionary, but in the bigger picture it's more familiar to, like, Saint Laurent, his aesthetic isn't something we've never seen before.
Well, we said that at the review of this. We were saying there was something Heidi Slimane underneath it, more colourful, obviously.
More colourful, but also this feels luxurious in the way that Saint Laurent sometimes struggles to. And I think it's perhaps, maybe he's learned from watching, the pasting that Slimane gets, and he's saying, well, we can do it, and we can do it in the Gucci way, in the luxury way, and that is bringing that DNA of Gucci that it is all about the finest fabrics, the most ridiculously expensive exotic skins. That's what that brand is. So to propose something that, you know, a Gucci customer or an old Gucci customer would never go to a thrift store and buy something, but to present something that is older and say actually it's, you know, beautifully made, and that's kind of what they want. They would never accept it if it looked cheap.
Do you think there is a kind of laziness in this from the consumers? I mean, in why we're seeing so many labels doing this kind of fake vintage, because people want that look without having to actually put the legwork in, because it's almost funny when you see the Saint Laurent pieces, like they are things that you
But I think it is more difficult to do the legwork because there's so many people who are in the industry then mining the same sources. So even like, you know, vintage used to be an affordable way for often people to dress a bit differently, you know, eschew the high street. But now the best stuff is, you know, the internet and collectors, you know, they've made life easier for themselves, but it's also kind of industrialized it a bit. So I think it's perhaps harder to scour those pieces. And also, I think a lot of the stuff is, you know, if it's 20 years old, it's not going to be well made. You have to go really far back, and then it is obviously really expensive, and it's, you know, that kind of old-fashioned couture style.
Because it didn't even used to be vintage when we did it. It was just called
second-hand.
Yeah. But
it was completely rebranded with the recession.
I was talking to Bae Garnett about this, because when she did Cheap Date, obviously it was so much about thrifting, and she kind of, it's really hard to imagine that the point where she's kind of started doing that, like, you know, thrifting, like she made it cool, and it was cool in certain circles, but it wasn't like this like luxurious thing. It was this kind of counterculture. You need to opt out of the fashion system.
And consumerism.
It's so wedded in that sense of being fashionable. But I think it has become very commercialised and commodified, like vintage. Like it's very hard to get cheap vintage now. And you look at things like, you know, they're great sites in some ways, things like First Dibs and stuff, but it's really...
So in that sense, this is almost a bit cynical then, isn't it? Because it's kind of trying to get all of those references, but actually still retain something that's very commercial. I still love that red dress though.
It's so
I think
amazing.
that dress is great.
I also wonder like how deliberate it is. I do think also, I don't know how cynical he is being. I think, did you see all the pictures of his house and his studio that were shot? I think he is also just obsessed with old things.
He definitely is.
So in a way, this is just kind of his reality.
And I mean, if you think about it cynically, I went to Vista at the weekend for the first time in a very long time, and I just thought it's become so insane. It's slick. Everything is still really expensive, but it's really new. But they've seen the value. It doesn't matter that it's the newest thing. People don't care that it's the newest thing. They just don't think, oh, I loved it, I want it. If it was from 5 seasons ago or from now, I will pay a lot of money. And I think they've probably realised that and think, well, we can, you know, we don't need to show them new ideas. We just need to show them something that they're going to love. And that's the whole vintage thing again. It's, you know, I think it's all kind of perhaps quite cynical of me to think that.
Do you think designers are getting less seasonless then because of that? They're just trying to kind of...
Yeah, perhaps.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Dressing less seasonless. Or
getting
more seasonless.
Yeah, they're focusing less on the season. They're just trying to kind of grab people. Because Saint Laurent, you're right, like you wouldn't actually recognise from collection to collection, which is why everyone always says it looks the same every season. That's interesting.
But that's kind of, I mean, the seasonless thing is also to do with the kind of global life that we're all living, or not all of us, but more of us.
You are flying in
and you know that we don't need. We might be travelling from one season to another and back again.
Exactly.
But the other thing I was thinking about these clothes is that they're very clever in the sense that they're kind of cross-generational too. So they're, you know, and each look kind of looks like it's assembled from, you know, something that your little sister has, something your grandmother has, something your boyfriend has, and something that you own. And in that way, each look kind of appeals to a very broad market, which I think is really clever. And I kind of, Yeah, I agree with you. You know, I do think there's definitely a kind of commercial cleverness in this approach.
I think it's a bit more sympathetic than, you know, you talked about Saint Laurent, you know, in terms of, it's much more sympathetic to a customer of different age groups. The Gucci, I think it has a wider appeal.
No, you're right, and I think also it's styled in a way that makes it look very kind of fashion, but actually you see that look, sorry, can you just, the one with the skirt, and like the little pussy bow blouse. If you imagine, you know, that's styled in a way that makes her look very kind of, you know, madcap, left bank academic, whatever. But you imagine that in the store, that skirt's going to appeal to a kind of older, moneyed woman who wants something pretty for a party. And I think that's what's quite clever. Whereas Saint Laurent, even when you pull it apart, those pieces are still incredibly youthful and incredibly kind of like short. And I think this is just styled very well. He's very good at presenting a vision, which is interesting. What's been made a lot of actually more I think perhaps than the vintage thing is the gender thing. People talk so much about, you know, androgyny and do we find what he's doing there interesting in that respect?
I think definitely. I mean, certainly when we're that last row there with the kind of pyjama suit. I mean, it's very hard to tell whether that's a man or a woman, isn't it? And I think gender identity is really in the public consciousness at the moment with kind of, you know,
it really is.
Caitlyn
also,
Jenner
who thought that Gucci would be the brand to address it?
Well, that's
They're
what's kind of interesting
kind of
in
it
being
was
an
so
Italian
tied
brand.
down in that idea of femininity, masculinity, sexiness, machismo. And, you know,
a few years ago they had Berlusconi, you know, and now they've got this, which is kind of amazing, really.
Well, it's
isn't
interesting also to think in the context of Alessandro Michele's work, because he's quite a devotee of Tom Ford. Obviously, he joined the company when Tom.
But this is a very different type of sensuality.
Yeah,
from
exactly.
that.
And he's really paid respect to Tom Ford. But then you think this is so different to those adverts, you know, like female model over the lap of a male model, or like, you know,
or the famous G.
yeah, the G.
exactly. It's very different.
But then that's kind of Tom Ford has stuck with it, and he's become very singular in that. This is a modern update on what people are talking about sex-wise, and this is probably quite extreme. You know, in the way that the shaved G was extreme then. This is probably, you know, Daily Mail readers are probably like, what is this? This is awful.
I don't think it's that extreme. I think it's extreme
No.
because it's an Italian brand.
I know, but I think it's
that's
extreme, not for us, but I think some people view it as extreme.
I do think people are still, in general, confused and quite disturbed when they can't tell what someone's gender is. I think it really like befuddles people, and I think to see that celebrated on a runway is really, because it's actually really interesting to keep comparing this to Saint Laurent, because Saint Laurent is gender is treated quite conservatively at Saint Laurent, even though people make a lot of how, you know, effeminate or skinny the boys are. Gender is very distinct. The boys are dressed like boys, and the girls are dressed like girls, and the girls look like the girlfriend of the boy. Whereas this is not. It doesn't feel like there's anything to do with coupling or relationships put into that, which is
It's
quite
much
interesting.
more sort of to do with family. I don't know, to me it seems like, which again is a very clever way of kind of connecting to Gucci's history.
And Italy,
because it feels,
again,
exactly.
Because Italy's known for the family, isn't it?
And despite the fact that Italy is that kind of notion of a family, I guess, is generally thought of to be very conventional. It still has that.
It's a modern family.
It's a kind of modern family, where you would wear your brother's clothes or.
I think it's also a lot to do with, you know, the actual presentation style as well. It's very sensitive, you know, it's not brash and, you know, like you expect a Gucci show to be. You know, the music and the setting, it's all very
much more subtle.
Yeah, very sensitive.
But that family thing, that's kind of, because everyone's talking about it as the Tenenbaums about Margot, and that, I think that probably is perhaps one of, you know, the most dysfunctional but loving families in film for a long time. So maybe that's perhaps why it makes you think of family as well.
I just think he does reference film a lot, and I think the kind of films that he talks about referencing is quite interesting. A lot of them aren't really romantic films. They are more things to do with kind of interesting characters and their lives and relationships, which is interesting. Why is androgyny and gender so in the air at the moment? I know fashion's latched onto it in a certain way as well, which I think is kind of pushing it within fashion.
Yeah.
But it does feel like it's in the air beyond just fashion.
But I think it's also important to remember, you know, people have been doing it. You know, Raf Simons, Com with you know, with the menswear. There have been a lot of people, even Rick Owens, have been doing it for a long time. It just seems with, you know, with all the stuff we've talked about, it is just in the air at the
But there is more now, I think, than there ever was.
Because it's more acceptable for people not to have those boundaries. You know, it's acceptable for people not to define themselves through their gender, and fashion's picked up on that as a trend, really, and utilised it in that way.
I mean, there's also lots of things happening, like, did you see the Catherine Ferguson film that she did for Selfridges, Agenda? Yeah, and that's a sort of 15 brands that are all doing kind of garments that are genderless or whatever. And I think Miuccia Prada's also talked about, you know, genderless clothing and everything. So it's interesting, there's the presentation, which can be gender fluid, and then there's the garments. And if you look at the garments are still quite gendered. It's just the presentation is not.
I think what's interesting though is there's always this irony when fashion latches onto it, because actually I think fashion's really conservative when it comes to gender. Like we have a men's week and we have a women's week. Most magazines are men's or women's. There aren't that many unisex magazines. You know, another actually started as a unisex magazine and then split to be another man and another. You know, shop floors are arranged men's. I know Selfridges have done they did that as a pop-up. But I think it's interesting, but I don't know how much. I think in the fashion pack we talk about, women are wearing menswear, this and that, but I wonder how much that goes beyond outside of fashion.
Outside of Dalston.
Yeah, but also, you don't see many unisex brands, you know.
No, I mean, there are more now. And also I think you're seeing it more with kind of the models as well, you know, obviously like Harry Neff or Leah T and all of these kind of gender fluid models who've become extremely popular. But yeah, I don't know whether it's going to really latch on, because I do think the culture is, as you say, very strictly defined into menswear and womenswear. I mean, even that's how we teach it, isn't it? We have menswear and womenswear.
Yeah.
But I think that's, you know, the magazines, it's probably because it's dictated by the advertisers. It's completely separate.
Yeah.
You know.
But the thing is also, it's kind of realising the difference between transgender and transgender issues and androgyny and gender fluidity. It's like, you know,
they're not all the same thing.
No, and there is I mean, I was reading recently that someone said we're not at the transgender tipping point yet, but we are on the way. We have got so much more awareness, so many more transgender activists who are in the public eye. Like Caitlyn Jenner, she has completely brought this issue to the world in a way that, you know, it's kind of you know, amazing. And although that's a very separate issue to this kind of androgyny, it generally, I think it's just part of the general discussion much more.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? I think you're right, people could tend to lump it all together, but there's two very different things at play, one of which is refusing to be defined by your gender, and one of them is actively, you know, almost being defined by your gender. And I interviewed Harry Neff actually quite recently, and she talked about that, where she said that for her, becoming a woman was just a line of best fit. She was kind of like, you do kind of almost have to choose. And I think what's interesting is fashion is playing a lot with this notion of not having to choose, which is quite interesting.
I think that's really interesting. Why do you have to choose? You know, that seems very old-fashioned thinking, certainly in an art school. So,
although these, you know, this collection doesn't feel like the clothes are gendered. It's more like you choose to put on the clothing of the opposite sex. It's not very radical, really. It's actually still very conservative.
That was the point I was kind of trying to make earlier, actually, that there's the person and then there's the clothes, and they're separate things, really. And these clothes are not gendered or ungendered. They are gendered.
Yeah.
It's interesting though. I do think, you know, fashion. We talk about androgyny, and it tends to refer to, you know, I think in fashion it tends to refer to women wearing men's clothing, and I think it has been interesting recently to see designers putting men in feminine clothing. You know, you can, like Jean Paul Gaultier's done it for absolutely yonks, but like you could look at someone like J.W. Anderson, who I think kicked off a real interest in that. And again, it's really interesting to see that at a massive luxury house like Gucci, because I think J.W. Anderson gave a quote quite recently where he said he thought perhaps they were too ahead of the times when he'd done it, and no one quite understood it for AJ-Dubs.
And now everybody's catching up.
But yeah, now everyone's doing it, and I think that's quite interesting, that kind of like hyper-feminine thing that's happening with men, which is interesting. Who else is exploring gender in interesting ways? Because it's happening in very different ways. If you look at something like Hood by Air, it's very different there.
Yeah, I don't know. I was thinking about. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking more about historically where it's gone, you know, and where it came from, and I mean, even again going back to Chanel, she was putting women in men's clothes, wasn't she? And probably like the 20s was really when it started with the kind of flapper and the bob, and then, you know, in the war, functional clothing and all that kind of thing, and then, you know, you go through the eras to the smoking jacket, the famous Saint Laurent image, and then, I mean, you can see this trajectory all the way along, but who's doing it interestingly at the moment? Because to me, this is a styling exercise. It's not actually.
It's not what the brand's about. Like something like Womenswear is wrapped up in this idea of, you know, counterculture. It's wrapped up in this idea of kind
it
of.
Would be like a gender. I think that idea was really radical. And there are some other brands in America that are doing clothing that's supposed to be
like
genderless.
Telfar and stuff like that. Yeah, that's interesting.
But it's more in America than here, I think.
I think Raf Simons is really important because I think he published that book maybe 10 years ago called The Third Sex, and that was all about that sort of space between manhood and boyhood, and it was sort of, you know, it was sort of questioning that sort of gender lines, you know, and I think he's always pushed about, well, you know, what in terms of his models and presentations of, you know,
or even the Belgians again in general, and de Millimeter, you know, was great for that.
And I was, when you were talking about her, you know, these collections, I was thinking it's so like Dries Van Noten's approach. You know, the Gucci, it feels so nostalgic and comfortable.
I think the Belgians are very genderless in a way, in the way that they think design-wise. So,
Raf's interesting as well because Raf, not last season but the season before, put women on his runway and just they were just wearing exactly the same clothes as the boys, like, and that was quite interesting, and it kind of happened that season where I think it was the same season Prada did the gender manifesto thing at their show, and I thought that was really interesting, and again it didn't feel like they were kind of an accessory to the boy in any way. It was just kind of about, I guess, maybe just acknowledging that that women could wear those clothes. I'm not quite sure what point was being made there. I think that was quite nice. It didn't feel like it was like a statement. It was just kind of like girls that inspired him, that he'd probably enjoyed working with at Dior, and he thought they looked great in the clothes, so he put them on the runway. I think that was quite an interesting.
I mean, I think the thing you always run up against is the problem with anatomy, which is that, you know, women and men are often quite differently shaped, and so if you're going to really have a commercially successful line that's aimed at other than sort of younger people, then that's the difficulty.
Yeah, especially outside of fashion context, it's going to be very difficult for people to, like, because you wear men's clothes, Lou, don't you?
Yeah, a lot.
So why is that? And I know I'm not interviewing you.
It's like therapy. You're like, I don't know. I don't think I dress in a particularly. I mean, I dress in a boyish way in the kind of fashion cliche, but I don't like dressing to look like a boy. But I think I like men's designers, but like I like what Craig Green does, so I want to support his brand. But I don't know. I also think in fashion, like, I find I moan about this all the time, but I find high fashion for women very conservative. It tends to be like cocktail dresses, and there's not actually that many brands that I'm really excited by. So in the same way, you know, on the high street sometimes when you buy a men's jumper just because it's a bit cooler and it's a nicer shape, I tend to think that it's the same with high fashion. Like the men's stuff, it just feels more relevant. It's like better day wear.
Yeah, but how do you feel about, you know, in terms of sizing and, you know, are you purposely buying something because it's too big? Is it part of that?
I think a bit of it, but not always. The sizing is annoying actually, because I bought those Raf Simons flares, the men's ones, the knitted one, and they fit weirdly on a girl because they're like they have space for like male genitalia.
That is the
so
problem.
They look a bit, so that is frustrating. I like oversized stuff, so maybe that's part of it. But I just think menswear at the moment is more exciting. Like it's a bit cooler. Like I think
and I think that's what Phoebe, you know, tapped into at Celine, wasn't it? That she sort of understood that a lot of women were doing that. I mean, I buy a lot of men's clothes too, and it is always a problem of fit.
Yeah, it is. I think that is a problem. I'm trying to think why. I think I just did it because I like the brand.
Yeah. But would you ever ask, let's say, if you know Craig, obviously, would you ever say, could you make me that? But in a
No, because that's why I think I go on about this all the time.
Then they'll put a bust on
no,
and ruin the whole thing.
That's why I think he's such a brilliant designer, though,
Yeah.
because his design is so strong, and it's so sympathetic to the body anyway. That actually on a girl it looks great, because so much of his stuff it has like pulls and ties and tags.
Yeah.
But actually with Craig's stuff, like the jackets, I just yank them in at the waist a little bit. And he's got this top actually, I was wearing it the other day, which is it was like the t-shirt material where he kind of like wrapped and sewed into them and twisted it. And I was wearing it and everyone was asking me if it was common, I was saying it was Craig. And everyone was going about how would a man wear that, because on me it looks like it's designed to kind of hug under your boobs and like kick out. But obviously on a boy it would just look totally different, but it's so well designed. Like, so no, I probably would never ask them to make something different. I don't think, maybe I should.
But now that he's going to do women's wear.
But that actually upset me a bit
what-
when he's going to do women's, because I liked that I was like the cool girl that wore Craig Green, and now I'm like loads of girls going to wear it. It's a disaster.
But so would you still wear the menswear?
Probably, yeah. Probably, I think so.
But also I think this idea of fit is still, although I would kind of instinctively agree with it that I want something that's cut from my body, that's still it's very conventional. Why not wear something that's where the cut of the arm is like way out here? It's
Well, that's
it's kind of
Well, it's just when you buy a man's shirt and it can be fantastic and fit on the neck and everything else, and then it's sort of gaping at the boobs, which is kind of
that's true.
you know not so nice.
Layering.
Fit is actually maybe the area where beyond fashion circles people have accepted dressing in a way that is more genderless, because if you look at something like boyfriend jeans or a boyfriend jumper, that is so pervasive now. Like people who are completely removed from the fashion conversation, I think are much more comfortable with very oversized silhouettes. Like if you go to COS, it's like cocoon coat. So maybe actually fit is the one area where that kind of genderless fashion is filtered down.
Yeah.
And it's quite hard to find a really good cut on the high street. Like if I went into French Connection, I wouldn't. All those clothes are cut for tall women, so they don't fit anyway. So it sort of kind of ends up being.
Yeah, you're right. The oversized thing has just become quite easy. I think everyone does that. Just before, I'm conscious the show's going to start soon, but just before it does, I do want to talk about rebranding, which we've kind of touched on already. But I'm interested that it feels like the way to rebrand is this kind of revolutionary way that we've discussed. Saint Laurent is the really obvious example of that, but I think you should also look at Loewe with what J.W. Anderson did there. Is this just the way you have to rebrand now because fashion's so fast? Is it just that there's not really time to do things slowly? Why are so many brands doing it?
Well, I think you have to have a strong leader and you have to have a strong vision, otherwise it's doomed to fail, isn't
You've got
it?
such a short, everyone's got such short attention spans, so you've got a short time to really show your message, get it across, and so look at someone like Alex Wang at Balenciaga, like that didn't work because he didn't have a strong enough, not necessarily a strong enough vision, but he didn't necessarily have the confidence to say, I'm doing this, I'm starting again, I've been given this job for a reason.
So you have to make yourself indispensable.
Yeah, you have to make it, it's like, Givenchy by Riccardo Tisci, it's like you have to put your stamp on it.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Because people have that expectation, a change, that it was so documented about Frida leaving and everything. So there's an expectation, isn't there, that there has to be something new. Otherwise, you've lost that attention. People are looking for something else.
And it's like with Jill Sander, it's like designed by committee, and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
You really need to have, especially when you're selling it as a luxury proposition with one name, you need to have a singular vision, and people will either love it or hate it. But you have to give that something has to happen to be that strong,
but it's
that strong
obviously
message.
also such an enormous risk for them because there's so much riding on it, so if they just took someone from outside then who doesn't understand how it works, which is why in a way you can see why they went with him, because he already knew the company and already knew how they functioned. But it was a bit sort of Greek, wasn't it, the way it happened.
It's a strange one though, I wonder if it's got, I think fashion's always had a short attention span and been quite cutthroat with these appointments, but I wonder if it has got worse because fashion's so viewed now, the shows are
I think also the fact that the resort shows are a thing now as well means that there is nowhere to hide. You can't just have a commercial collection that you pump out to the shop floor and those customers won't necessarily, they'll ignore the catwalk collection, but they know they can get this and this and this. So because there's nowhere to hide, everything has to be really immediate, really strong. And also the conversation is so loud about fashion. It's it's on Instagram, it's on Twitter, it's everywhere. Everyone's kind of being completely saturated with these images and ideas way more than they used to be, and people know who's at what brand, I think much more than perhaps, I mean in the 90s, yeah, but I think it died down a bit, and then now everyone's like back into who's going where and blah blah. Even if they're not shopping those brands, there's still knowledge.
But that's sort of to do with the celebrity of the designer, the cult of the designer, and particularly I think with older brands, you know, they because there is such a weight of
heritage
history and heritage, you have to bring in somebody with a very clear identity who will, with the confidence to kind of to be radical.
But then they also have to sort of commit to them, because we talked about that in one of the other ones, didn't we? It was Schiaparelli, and you know, if you're only given a couple of seasons, that's not really long enough to develop as well sometimes. So.
That cult of the designer thing is getting much worse, though. I think, you know, feels like, you know, everyone talks about the kind of the Galliano McQueen years as if that was the time where designers were really kind of like hedonistic and nuts and what have you. Whereas it feels like now it's just manifested itself in a really different way, which is kind of quite old school, that you have to have this like gang of women around you if you're a designer, and you have to be very. But I think that's definitely a social media thing now. That designers, you know, they're so present. Like if you look at someone like Olivier Rousteing and Balmain or Riccardo Tisci, which I imagine must be quite intimidating if you're a young designer.
And it's so different from if you think about Margiela and how he hid his identity, wanted to be, you know, completely anonymous. And doesn't that sound appealing now in a funny way?
I just don't do that now. I just think
I know.
because of those, and I'm going to say
I'm getting wistful for the privacy of the past.
I just don't think you could. Like, you know, that novelist, Elena Ferrante, is that how you say it? I'm like fascinated by the concept of producing something really, really brilliant and no one knows like who you are, if you're a man or a woman, anything like that. But with fashion, it's just, I don't think that would work. Imagine if you just saw a collection, you had no idea who designed it, it just kind of appeared. It would be such a refreshing thing, I think. But I think people like that connection. They need that spokesperson. And
even what you were saying about Raf's girl models. You know, you said maybe there were girls he worked with at Dior that he liked, or you know, it's more about them, about their identity, and as
well, it's like putting the personality into the clothes as well.
Yeah.
And people, you know, it's kind of really difficult.
So it's almost like the personality is taken over from the clothes in a funny way.
Well, I think it's about taste, and I think it's about this idea that, you know, and that's what someone like J.D. Anderson always bangs on about, but it's this idea that to be a good designer now, you're not really a designer, you're a creative director, and it's all about pulling together different things. And I think if you're building a whole brand on that sense of curation, then you have to have an identity, because then it's like people are buying into your taste. Otherwise it's like, whose taste is it? Like who? And I think people like that thing of, people really like having someone to give them sort of an opinion or advice. You know, I think that's a real thing. It's like that seal of approval. It's like you're buying into someone else's taste level.
But that implies that we're never going to have another designer artist again.
Well, that's why I think someone like Craig is really great, because it's so much about design. But I think I think there are
about concept,
but there aren't that many, I think, anymore who operate like that. It is much more about, I think,
and it's wedded to social media, and it's wedded to this digital. Yeah, it's a very interesting time.
I think it's just because people can be so famous through fashion now. You know,
and it's so accessible.
Yeah.
For so many people to be part of that community.
But do you think it's getting worse, the kind of people who are attracted to it because of those positions where you can, you know, be hanging out on yachts all the time and living a kind of, because that's what the life of a designer looks like, I think, in some ways.
I think with, you know, McQueen dying and all of those kinds of tragedies, even Galliano's history, I think, and nobody is under any illusion of what the pressure's like at the top. I don't think any of our students think if they get those top jobs they're going to be hanging out on yachts most of the time.
And they see the reality of Fashion Week and working with designers
if they're
really early on, so they realise it's not all glamour.
That's the big lie. That's the big lie, isn't it? It looks so glamorous, but actually there's a lot of work.
No, completely.
Sorry. Such a downer, Debbie Downer.
I'm really excited. We should go back to what we were saying at the start. It's really exciting now to like. It's that thing, you know, before when you used to look at Gucci.
You knew what it would be.
Yeah.
And now we don't know.
You dread it.
Exactly. Exactly. You'd kind of go and you'd be like, oh. And But now it's really part of the fashion conversation, which is really interesting.
But it'd be
But then
interesting
maybe
to see how he moves it on.
Because maybe you need to have the change in order to have the
I
excitement.
don't think he will move it on there. I'm going to say this, he'll probably do like a completely like black, all black.
No, I'm with you. I'm with you. I think it'll be similar.
Yeah, that's what the
Yeah.
Saint Laurent thing I think has
Have to
proved.
be.
It's like
Shall
you
we bet?
set your statement and then you just
Bet.
You
do
can tell
it.
by the carpet it's going to be the same.
Yeah. But then that's going back to that conservatism. It's like, it's what the buyers want. So how long will they do the same thing? Or how long will he do the same thing? And then, I mean, obviously, because it's so personal to him, it will always have that touch. But it does need to evolve in the way.
But I think the problem is when you do a collection like the ones he's done, in a way, you think, how can they evolve? Because I think it's partly the problem with Saint Laurent. When the collections are so kind of madcap and whimsical anyway, when they have so many different elements and they're not about one idea, it's quite hard to then do something different, because I couldn't tell you, I couldn't be like, last season was this season, it's very much about individual garments and looks, so it's like, you can't really then do anything different.
But I think that it's interesting though, because when you look at that last collection, it does feel contemporary.
Yeah.
When you compare it to Gucci maybe 3 years ago, 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So even though it is nostalgic and retro, it does still feel current, and that's kind of an interesting place to be, isn't it? How you do continue.
I like the carpet.
I like the carpet. He's obsessed with interiors though. Like, I think there was one print in the last collection that was like based on the lining of his pug's like dog basket or something. It was like something really nuts like that. But his house is amazing. If people haven't seen the pictures, they should definitely go online and look at it and all the weird things he collects.
Well, I think Patton's having a real moment at the moment anyway, isn't
Yeah,
it, in general?
It's interesting to think about this in the context of the digital print kind of phenomenon, because this is so different to that. You know, it equally is kind of like eye-popping, but very much about kind of, this nostalgia.
But it's interesting, the first outfit's got the Gucci stripes. You know.
But I think he's really good at doing that.
clever.
I think he's really good at bringing in the branding in a way that is really, really obvious, like quite overt branding, like the G's and the colours, and it's more prim than I was expecting. It's quite kind of, it is more kind of grown-up sexy, like that kind of slash to the navel. I think it's interesting that that's not slash to the navel, but slash like low. Everything he's done before was very much like this kind of a really high, but quite a bow. But then she's got more flesh on the show as well with that high slit.
I really do like those snakes on the floor.
Yeah.
I just want the carpet.
Yeah, I'm surprised by the amount of flesh, like the chest.
So we've got a bit of chinoiserie in there now.
Well, he talked about actually how inspired he was by the Met, China through the Looking Glass.
But that's also very clever commercially too.
It's interesting they're in heels. I think it's interesting we've just been talking about gender and how, whereas this does feel very womanly.
This, a lot more feminine.
Yeah, very feminine. Like this is, I think, more conservative than the others have been, even though they've all been very old.
And alluding more to type, like to the kind of bohemian or the granny.
He's thought, just to give you some context, he said,
Oh gosh.
the Women's Spring Summer 16 collection is the product of a situationist derive, the playful, I can't read out loud because I'm dyslexic, so bear with me. The playful practice of crossing and exploring urban spaces. And then he talks about adopting an unconventional strategy of geographical displacement punctuated by random and indefinite movements, paths take shape according to the stimuli of the city. So I think there is that sense of kind of travel. And he's talked about this reference of the Carte de Tendre, which is published in 1654 by Madeleine de Scudéry, a map of tenderness, which I wonder if that was the writing that was on that garment. But I don't know.
I mean, the kind of 70s element is important in relation to gender, I think, and thinking that it came, you know, that after the late 60s there was a kind of slight dystopian feel, or a kind of feeling of the failure of that revolution, and that, you know, maybe the fashion kind of reflected that in it a little more conservatism.
But it's interesting, you know, big brands are now going to be tackling this gender lines, you know, it is completely mainstream. You know, is it going to completely shift what we see at college and you know what our youthful generation are thinking about how they're presenting themselves?
I find it interesting because I think when you work in fashion you get so absorbed in it, and sometimes I find it, you know, amusing even just to talk to friends or people I went to school with, and you realise how the ideas that we think are normal within fashion really haven't filtered down at all in some ways.
This feels a lot looser than the last collection, I have to say.
Yeah.
It's not as tight in terms of what he's trying to say, but I guess he's had longer to do it.
I also think it is about this idea of different places and different spaces, so I think maybe there's that deliberately. I think it feels much more grown up. I think it doesn't feel there was a kind of childish sensibility to some of the other stuff, you know, that they look like kids. Often some of the pieces are quite infantile, like the collars and stuff. Whereas like there's still the kind of whimsy in this. I think the women look like women, you know, they're kind of wearing heels, and even just their hair, it's less kind of like all over the place. They look quite groomed.
It looks a bit more expensive as well, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
it does,
in terms of-
definitely.
It's very beautiful.
It is really beautiful. Apart from if I see one more person at Fashion Week wearing those loafers with the fur on them, it's like bloody hell. I think the really high heels are significant because they're quite like, it's interesting that he talked about it's not about sexiness, it's about sensuality, and then they're kind of like a Tom Ford, like Frida Giannini, like killer heel type shoe that some of them are wearing.
I definitely think textiles have made a much bigger impression on this collection than they were in the previous one. It was a lot more, I mean, it's colourful, beautiful colours, but there was less of a textile element, wasn't there, last season? Whereas the fabrics are amazing.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. It's very product-y, which I think is
But he's done that really well.
really well. Because I think that's something Gucci collections didn't have before. There was always like a horsebit loafer or like some bag, but they didn't feel product-y. Whereas there's like so much stuff, like, you know, all the jewellery and all the like the glasses and the bags and shit. You know, it feels really like stuff, which is I think also what Saint Laurent is really good at. It's that like stuff, like,
merchandising.
yeah.
There's more work in it. Just generally,
it
I
does
think
look
there is.
more.
It just looks like there's more work in it.
It's just really layered, isn't it?
There's almost like parts of Etro, Missoni, you know, there's bits of everything.
It's so, I find it interesting because it's so out, in a way it's so in step with what's going on, but if you think about it in this compared to something like Celine or this compared to something like Louis Vuitton, it's so different, and it's interesting to see Gucci kind of have that identity. It doesn't feel like just like luxury clothes, like just more. I like it a lot actually. And also you can tell it's just going to get shot completely to death as well.
Yeah.
And similar to last time, a really strong colour palette.
It's not quite what I was expecting though. I think I was thinking he would do something that was more, more androgynous and more loose, whereas I didn't expect quite as much of the kind of done up, like, you know, very much like little shirts and little.
But it's quite light-hearted as well. You know, there are elements of humour, like a tie with a ladybird on it. It's quite funny.
It has that, it's like dress up. Isn't it? It has that feeling again of.
I just hear him saying fake vintage now every time I look at it, and I do think about it like that.
But that's very, I think that's very sort of now, the idea, because we're sort of wise to the kind of fakeness of that authenticity somehow, or trying to pretend, you know, because I guess because you can't actually go to a vintage shop and buy something for £10 that's incredible. You can't do that anymore, so that doesn't feel very real anyway. Like, that's kind of a myth now. So it kind of makes sense to just do it beautifully and technically beautifully.
Yeah, these are the kind of gorgeous things you would hope to find.
You would hope to find, exactly.
But never would. It's fantasy vintage.
Because the Gucci archives brought them all up as reference.
Yeah, exactly. They've got hordes of interns running around Europe finding the best
that's
things.
actually
And then
what they do at Saint Laurent. They just send them off to buy really good stuff.
That's what everyone does everywhere.
I know. I'm still holding a grudge against a vintage person who held something for me, and then I won't say who it was. A very well-known designer wanted it, and it was held for me. They sold it to them.
Did they?
Yes, I know. Never went back.
And did you see it on the catwalk?
Yeah,
You did.
yeah.
Oh, that's upsetting.
It's only 10 years ago. I've forgotten about it really.
I was speaking to Kerry Taylor about this, and she said it's interesting because a lot of the people that buy stuff from her at the auction house, it is houses buying back their own stuff. But there's not that same sense of people kind of, she said there's, and also people have cottoned on to collecting dress and how much you can kind of invest in that and what it can be.
The value of it.
I don't think it's that notion of someone just buying a vintage thing because they love it and they want it. I don't think those kind of people.
That's the amazing thing with the poppies. That sort of cape with the poppies is quite fab.
Well, it's just that clothes as commodity thing in every angle.
But I think, having seen the Erdem show the other day and then this, I think this one is it's got that really fantastical feeling about it. Whereas the other one was sort of whimsical, this one takes it on
But that's what I can't
to a
work
whole
out,
other
is
level,
I'm
I think, in a way.
Why does this femininity feel current when, I thought the Erdem collection was beautiful, but I didn't think it felt particularly modern.
It
has
felt
some
pastiche.
Yeah, this has some irony, and there's a little bit of humour and
the contrast as well. The contrast between things is really nice.
and some ugliness, some jarring.
Yeah, because it's awkward.
There's nothing ugly in Erdem. It's all beautiful and tasteful, and
that's interesting.
and this has some grit in the oyster, if you like.
Because the menswear is really retro. It's I don't know many guys that could pull off that total clash of prints. But it's interesting to think about what the old Gucci customer will think about this, because it's such a different aesthetic, isn't it, in terms of sort of the
But again, I think it's probably a lot of it is styling. If you remove the styling, I bet you anything, if you put those garments next to each other, they would be.
Even those trousers are quite a good example.
Yeah.
Of that. I think if you merchandised it in the
and
store.
The shirt,
And also, the store is really interesting. I went into the Gucci shop on Main Street, and they really, I'm sure it's the same with a lot of those luxury stores, but I found it particularly with Gucci, is they kind of, I wanted to try on the shoes with the fairy pom-poms, and she was asking me all about what I'd thought of the collection, and she immediately, tried to ascertain whether I was someone who obviously cared about fashion or someone who just wandered in, and she made notes on what I said I liked and stuff, and I thought that was really interesting. So I don't know, maybe she was just really brilliant at her job, but I don't know if they've also kind of briefed them to try and ascertain who's coming in because they love the runway collection, who's an old school Gucci shopper, who's just wandering in.
I'm sure it wasn't an accident.
But I thought that was really interesting that she asked me if I understood the difference between the runway collection and the kind of general stuff, and she was really, really informed, and I thought that was really great, because I think they'll just be, which is so different. If you go into something like Balenciaga or something, they're just hello, they don't do that.
But look at that colour combination. I mean, that's such a confident colour combination. He's a real colourist. We said this last time, didn't we?
I think there's more obvious evening wear in this one, which is interesting as well. I think they've probably realised that they can really carve out a space as doing great red carpet stuff, which I think, again, Gucci had kind of fallen out of that conversation, even though it was all gowns. None of the cool people wore Gucci, whereas a lot of this you can imagine being worn in that context, which is interesting.
It's very clever. I think it's moved on from last season in a good way.
But also, I think what was really important was the advertising that changed, because that's how a lot of people engage with it immediately. And
but do you not think it's funny with that advertising, because now the perfume adverts, they seem so out of step with the aesthetic of them. It's completely it's these toned
doesn't work.
Tanned lips, and then it's blends picture of someone taking a jumper off. It just doesn't sit at all.
Yeah, they need to get the story straight, don't
It'd
they?
be interesting to see if they do change that story, or if they kind of section the two ideas off.
But I think they'll section it, Givenchy, it's kind of the same, completely.
It's quite clever, I think, to maintain them both somehow. And again, it's like saying, it's fake vintage. It's saying, we've got this customer and we have this, but you know, and
it would be interesting to see if they do like a Gucci perfume that's in step with it.
This.
If they did a kind of
I think it would sell
that
well.
would make sense.
Yeah, I think it would sell. But what would it be called? Let's name it.
It would be, vintage.
Cool Granny.
Well, he loves
or
all
just
the
Granny.
clothes.
Just Granny.
It would be like the Santa Maria Novella ones, definitely.
Yeah.
He always has that stuff in the studio.
Italian
I
grandma. Ode Italian
Nonna.
grandma.
Yeah. It would be called something really
Transgender Principessa. I'd buy that.
I do like this though. I think
Yeah,
it's
I do.
interesting, and I think it is a step forward. And I was confused to see how he could do something different, but I think this does feel. I just think it does feel much more sexy. The other ones I thought were quite sexless, whereas this is very it is really seductive.
But it was all in a hurry, wasn't it, last season?
Well, the men's was in a real hurry.
But I have to say the women's wear
The
felt like
second
it felt like
yeah,
it was.
yeah.
It you know, it was good.
There's an
but
urgency about it.
Yeah. Whereas this one feels like, you know, there's been a big team and they've worked really hard and they've all pulled together and they've all had the same vision.
I also think part of it with this is I think the first few, quite understandably, felt like loads of ideas that he'd maybe had for years and years and years, and he was trying to get them all out. Whereas this feels much more like he was actually thinking about this as like one collection and kind of designing for that, rather than just going, oh, this is everything I'm about.
No, that was successful, I think.
I think it's interesting to see something kind of new and exciting, but I also think it's like there's so much stuff there that you almost can't not like something, and I think that's what's quite clever. Like you couldn't look at it and go. It's not like looking at a normal collection. Even when you look at like Celine or you look at Com, you're like, this is the concept of the season. This is what they're doing, and it's easier to go, oh, I like this or I don't like this. But with that, it's kind of. It's not a weaker collection for not doing that, but it's harder to kind of take offence to it in any way. It's like you either like
there's something for everybody, really.
Yeah. And I imagine if you really didn't like that aesthetic, you just wouldn't like it. But then you're never going to like it. But I think what he does, it's not kind of that punchy seasonal thing, so it's harder to take issue with it.
Well, what I like is that it's not beige. You know, I felt like Gucci got a little bit beige for a while. And
so unhappy. Every time we bring up old Gucci, you're like,
I just didn't understand it. I just really didn't.
yeah. I didn't get who that person was. It was.
Well, there's no one I've ever met in my life.
Yeah. But do you think you met that person?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I just think, I don't know, it just seems a bit more switched on to what everyone else is doing. From in fashion and in the real world, whereas that Gucci just felt like it existed in a bubble.
And
It
I
was
think
dated, wasn't it?
Yeah.
it wasn't doing well. I think that's important to
Well, that's
say.
the
Like
other
the
thing,
figures
is, you
weren't
know,
strong.
He's been brought in because, you know, if it's some brands care about critical acclaim, some brands don't. I think it's fair to say that Gucci, if it had been really successful, if they were making loads of money on it, it would have stayed as it is. So I don't know. It's interesting actually, because especially because it's Milan, and you don't go to Milan thinking you're going to see anything new except for like, you know, Prada or you know, a couple of new designers. But yeah, and also because it's, you know, the first show that most of the British press go out for. I think it's a really interesting position, and it kind of maybe will raise the game in Milan a bit. Interesting.
It is I was reading about him, and I think one thing that I find really interesting is he wanted to be a costume designer for a while, and it feels like he does approach fashion quite like costume. And I think I then started thinking about Miuccia Prada, and I thought she's so different. I think the way they operate is so different. Like there's, in a way, I think he thinks more about clothing than concepts, very much about pieces, and that's quite interesting to see a designer wear like that.
and yet they are related in a way.
Yeah.
Like you can see there's a relationship between them.
The colour, definitely, and the luxury,
And the
fabrics.
ugly thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the
You know,
ugly,
she
that
did
confidence
ugly
of
first,
ugliness.
didn't
Yeah.
she?
But it's interesting, Rosie, you said, you know, there's something for everyone. I bet, is that a designer's worst nightmare to have that comment about a collection?
But isn't that, in a way, that's also, I see that as a concept in itself. It's to
Yeah.
do with-
Yeah.
and it connects back to the kind of gender ambiguity, because it's like becoming identity being fluid, and you can dress,
Yeah.
you know,
Well,
with
it's
this
that
character.
inclusivity thing
Yeah.
that you don't expect from high fashion.
Yeah. Which I think is what that is about. I think it's the sense of like, come in, like,
Yeah.
it's like, you know, it's apt that he's obsessed with home and like housing, because it is that kind of that spirit of like entertaining and welcoming, and I think that is interesting. I'm interested to see how this filters down though, because I think it was really interesting to see Saint Laurent be kind of ripped off by the high street and how that changed what women are wearing. And I'm interested to see
how it will happen with
effect,
this, and whether we will have this kind of shift from sexy to sensuality. That would be lovely, wouldn't it?
Because there are so many young girls who look like the Saint Laurent, like all those little dresses and like leather jackets. It'd be interesting if everyone starts looking like Margot Tenenbaum on the shoes. Great. So we're impressed then.
I think so. I think it's quite.
really
I think there's something modern in the kind of gender androgyny thing, and I think there's something really modern in the sensuality rather than overt sexiness, which is, you know, what Italy did forever. It was sexy, 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 and that seems so boring now, doesn't it?
Yeah, really boring. It's just not.
It's just so one-dimensional.
Yeah, I was thinking about this with the Versus show. Did you go to that? And it was just like, I was like, who is there? Who are these people that want to look like? It just felt so out of step. Whereas this feels very much kind of, I want to go and like tie ribbons around my neck and wear lots of jewellery and like get some potpourri.
Dig out the
That's
brooches.
the thing about the Versus thing. It's like it doesn't make sense in the context of London.
Yeah.
It would work so much better in New York or somewhere where it's just, you know, I don't know, this I think is quite London, so it'd be interesting to see what the international reaction is. Like in the Middle East, I'm sure Gucci is, you know, having quite a difficult time, I'm sure, because it's not what it's been built on.
And yet there's embellishment and there's kind of, you know, all of the things which
the
is
stuff is so showy. Some of it, like actually when you look at some of the bags, they're quite hideous. They're like beaded with like huge butterflies and stuff, and it's quite like, you're like, okay, this is a showy audience would like this. Not to say all Middle Eastern shoppers are showy, but I think there's that audience that can buy it in that very kind of like elevated, tasteful, like, and then there's...
That's why it's clever, because you can sort of, you know, have this incredibly expensive, incredibly hand-worked, you know, beaded bag and your jeans, and it works in one context, but it also works in a very dressy, over-the-top, showy environment too. It might just, they might pull it off.
Yeah, I'm sure they will. I'm sure they're clever enough to do it.
That's a nicely optimistic note to end on. They might pull it off.
Well, that's high praise from me.
Yeah. Should we give them a round of applause?
Yes.